On the evening of the 26th of February 2026, in a private event space on the upper floor of a Rodeo Drive building whose address appears on no public listing and whose elevator requires a key card that is issued by invitation only, Chanel hosted what its internal communications referred to simply as an intimate client celebration. The guest list ran to 41 names. Every one of them had been personally approved by the house's global client relations director in Paris. Every one of them understood, without being told, that what happened inside that room was not for public consumption. There were no photographers beyond the house's own archival team. There was no social media posting permitted. There was, in the particular atmosphere that Chanel has spent over a century constructing and defending with a consistency that puts most governments to shame, an unspoken but absolute understanding of what the evening was and what it was not. It was not a spectacle. It was not a platform. It was a room in which the brand's most valued relationships were quietly reaffirmed in the way that only genuine exclusivity can reaffirm them. By midnight, it would be remembered for something else entirely. Before we begin today's royal update, I want to take a quick moment. Many of you enjoy these videos but haven't subscribed yet, and you definitely don't want to miss the latest developments and fascinating stories from the world of royalty. Subscribing is completely free and helps you stay up to date as every new royal moment unfolds. And while you're here, let us know, where are you watching from? Share it in the comments below. It's always wonderful to see viewers joining us from all around the world. Chanel is not a fashion house in the way that phrase is commonly understood. It is an institution with a value system so internally consistent and so deliberately maintained across decades of cultural upheaval that its decisions carry a weight that extends far beyond the commercial. When Chanel endorses, the endorsement means something specific and considered. When Chanel withdraws, the withdrawal means something too. The brand has never needed to explain itself publicly because its silence has always been more eloquent than any statement its communications team could draft. It has dressed heads of state and refused heads of state. It has cultivated relationships with women of extraordinary power and quietly declined relationships with women of extraordinary fame when the two qualities failed to overlap in the ways the house required. Its blacklist, a word the brand itself would never use, is not a list at all. It is simply an understanding, communicated through the particular language of doors that do not open and invitations that do not arrive, that a relationship which was never formally begun has been formally concluded. Meghan arrived at the Rodeo Drive building at 9:14 in the evening, accompanied by 2 members of her personal team and a security detail of 3. She had not been on the evening's approved guest list. She had, according to sources with direct knowledge of the sequence of events, been informed through an intermediary earlier that week that her attendance at the event would not be possible. That communication, sources say, was received, acknowledged, and ultimately disregarded. What Meghan's team had calculated, in the particular logic of a circle that has grown accustomed to leveraging visibility as currency, was that the presence of a woman of her public profile at the door of an event would create a social complexity that the house would find easier to absorb than to refuse. That calculation reflected a fundamental and consequential misunderstanding of the institution at whose door they were arriving. Chanel has never found refusal difficult. It has always found capitulation unthinkable. The senior client relations representative who met Meghan's party in the entrance foyer had been briefed in advance. The briefing had come directly from Paris, confirmed in writing, and had been specific enough in its instruction that the representative required no improvisation and sought no further guidance in the moment. The conversation that followed lasted approximately 90 seconds. It was conducted in a voice low enough that the 2 other guests passing through the foyer at that moment did not catch a single word of it. What was said, according to a source who was briefed on its contents by the representative afterward, was precise, professional, and entirely without hostility. Meghan and her party had not been included on this evening's guest list. The event was at capacity. The house wished her a pleasant evening. That was all. It was the kind of dismissal that derives its power entirely from its quietness, from the absolute absence of drama in its delivery, from the refusal to offer anything that could be engaged with or escalated or reframed. Meghan's response was none of those things. Delivered at a register that the two passing guests later confirmed they heard clearly, the four words that would define the next several weeks of cultural conversation were not a question despite their implied interrogative. They were a statement of position, a declaration of identity deployed as a weapon in a moment when every other weapon had been removed. "You don't know who I am." Representative's reply, 5 words, approved in advance by the Paris office, was delivered in the same quiet and professional tone in which the entire exchange had been conducted. "We know exactly who you are." Meghan's party left the building 2 minutes later. Inside the event, those who had been close enough to the foyer to observe the exchange without hearing it noted only that something had occurred and that its outcome had been resolved with a speed and a finality that suggested it had been prepared for. One guest, a woman whose name appears regularly on Chanel's front row and whose relationship with the house spans 17 years, watched Meghan's party leave through the glass frontage and turned back to her champagne without comment. She didn't look surprised, another guest noted afterward. None of them did. To understand why the door closed with such finality on the evening of the 26th of February, one must go back further than the incident itself. The relationship between Meghan and Chanel did not begin with hostility. It began, as many of the most consequential falling outs do, with genuine mutual interest and the particular warmth of two parties who each believed, for a time, that the other had something they needed. In the spring of 2023, preliminary conversations were initiated between Meghan's representation and Chanel's North American Partnerships division regarding a potential long-term brand alignment. The discussions were exploratory in nature, but advanced enough to involve the exchange of formal documentation and the scheduling of 2 in-person meetings at the house's New York atelier. Sources familiar with the early stages of those conversations describe an atmosphere of cautious optimism on both sides. Chanel was navigating a moment of considered evolution in its ambassador relationships. Meghan represented a demographic reach and a cultural visibility that the house's internal data suggested was strategically relevant. For approximately 4 months, the possibility of a formal relationship existed and was taken seriously by people on both sides of the table. The first significant rupture came not from a dramatic confrontation, but from something considerably more mundane and considerably more revealing. A fitting session at the New York atelier in the autumn of 2023 had been arranged to allow Meghan's stylist team to work with house pieces in a context that would inform the shape of any future partnership. What occurred during that session was described by a source with direct knowledge of it as an experience the house's creative liaison team found profoundly uncomfortable. The specific details of what was demanded have not been fully disclosed, but sources characterized the session as one in which the expectations brought into the room bore no relationship to the protocols under which Chanel operates with any client at any level. Requests were made regarding permanent loan arrangements for pieces from the current collection. Directional input was offered, unsolicited and repeatedly, regarding how house items should be styled for Meghan's specific public appearances. And when the creative liaison gently redirected the conversation toward the house's standard partnership framework, the response from Meghan's team was described by one person present as the kind of pushback you would expect from someone who had already decided the deal was done and was simply waiting for the other party to catch up. It did not improve from there. In early 2024, a second meeting was convened, this time with more senior representation from the Paris office present via secure video link. It was, by multiple accounts, the meeting in which the possibility of a formal relationship effectively ended, though no one said so explicitly at the time. Meghan's team had arrived with a revised proposal that reframed the potential partnership in terms that sources describe as having placed Meghan's personal brand not alongside Chanel's identity, but above it. The language used in the proposal's core positioning document, later described in detail by a source who had read it, suggested that Chanel's association with Meghan would derive its primary value from her existing cultural authority rather than from the house's own century-long legacy. The Paris representatives on the video link said very little during that meeting. Their silence, one person present recalled, was the most eloquent thing in the room. What converted private reservation into formal institutional decision was a conversation that was never meant to leave Meghan's inner circle. In the late summer of 2024, a discussion involving two members of Meghan's team was relayed through a chain of social connections whose links have since been carefully traced to a journalist with ties to two American entertainment outlets. The substance of that conversation characterized Chanel's growing reluctance to formalize the partnership as being motivated not by legitimate brand considerations, but by a bias whose nature was left implicit, but whose implication was unmistakable. When the characterization reached Paris, the response was neither loud nor slow. A meeting was convened among 4 senior brand directors. It lasted 11 minutes. No formal minutes were recorded. But the instruction that emerged from it was communicated to the House's global client relations team within the hour and has not been revisited since. The decision was not punitive in its framing. It was simply conclusive. Chanel does not negotiate its reputation. It does not respond to implication. And it does not, under any circumstances, reopen a door that it has decided to close. What Meghan's team had fundamentally miscalculated at every stage of a relationship that had never fully begun was the nature of the institution they were attempting to leverage. Chanel's power has never derived from wanting to be wanted. It has always derived from its absolute willingness to want nothing from anyone who does not understand what it is. That willingness, demonstrated on the evening of the 26th of February with a quietness that hit harder than any public statement could have, was not new. It was simply, for the first time, directed somewhere everyone could see. There is a specific kind of damage that cannot be managed by a communications team, however experienced, however well-resourced, however practiced in the particular art of narrative reframing that has become the primary currency of modern celebrity crisis management. It is the damage that arrives not with noise, but with silence, not with accusation, but with withdrawal. Not with a statement that can be countered or a claim that can be disputed, but with the simple, devastating absence of something that was previously present. Chanel did not issue a press release. Chanel did not brief a journalist. Chanel did not post, comment, respond, or acknowledge. It simply stopped. And the stopping, in the particular language of an institution whose endorsement carries the weight it carries, said everything that 1,000 words of formal statement could not have approached. Within 72 hours of the Rodeo Drive event, the fashion landscape had registered the shift with the speed and precision of an industry that has always understood that the most important communications are the ones that never appear in writing. 3 brands whose conversations with Meghan's team had been ongoing at various stages of formality went quiet within that 72-hour window. No calls were returned. No follow-up meetings were confirmed. No explanations were offered because none were required. The industry spoke in the language it has always spoken in, the language of the unreturned call, the rescheduled meeting that never gets rescheduled, the warm relationship that becomes, without announcement or incident, a former one. 2 of those brands had been in discussions with Meghan's lifestyle venture for potential co-branded product lines. A third had been considering a front-row presence arrangement for the upcoming season. All 3 decisions were made independently and without coordination, which made them, paradoxically, more powerful than any coordinated response could have been. It was not a campaign. It was a consensus. And consensus of that kind, arrived at organically by people who simply looked at the same information and reached the same conclusion, is the one thing that no reframing exercise can touch. Inside the Montecito compound, the emergency communications meeting convened within 48 hours of the Rodeo Drive incident was, by accounts of those familiar with its outcome, a study in the particular dysfunction that emerges when a team of advisors fundamentally disagrees about the nature of the problem they are trying to solve. One faction argued for complete and dignified public silence, a strategy of behaving as though nothing of significance had occurred and allowing the story to exhaust itself without the oxygen of engagement. The other faction argued for a proactive reframing, a carefully placed interview or social media narrative that would position Meghan as the subject of institutional bias rather than the architect of institutional alienation. The argument between those two positions was, sources say, neither brief nor productive. What ultimately emerged was the worst possible synthesis of both. A response that was neither silent enough to be dignified nor loud enough to be effective. A carefully worded social media post from Meghan's team that addressed nothing directly, implied everything indirectly, and satisfied nobody completely. The internet's verdict was delivered within hours, and it was not kind. The moment the story crossed from fashion industry conversation into mainstream cultural reckoning came not from a newspaper editorial or a social media pylon, but from a television appearance by a stylist whose name carries genuine weight in the industry and whose previous public reticence on the subject of Meghan had been, to those who knew her professional history, conspicuous. She had worked with Meghan during the early royal years. She had been present at fittings and events and moments that had never been publicly discussed. She had, for years, declined every invitation to comment on her experience. On the morning of the 3rd of March, she accepted one. She did not use inflammatory language. She did not make specific accusations. She simply described, in the measured and precise tones of someone who had chosen their words over a long period of time rather than in the heat of a moment, a pattern of behavior in professional settings that she characterized as making genuine collaboration consistently difficult. She named no incidents. She needed to. The fashion community knew exactly what she was describing, and the mainstream audience, watching her careful and unembellished account, understood instinctively that they were hearing something that had been true for a long time and was only now being said out loud. The response from the British royal establishment was a silence so complete and so pointed that it functioned as its own form of commentary. No palace office issued a statement. No senior royal was quoted. No unofficial briefing was offered to any journalist. And from Kensington Palace, specifically from the office of the woman whose Instagram post had recently gathered 2 million likes in 3 hours in support of Lady Louise Windsor, there was nothing. Not a word, not a gesture, not an acknowledgement that the story existed at all. One royal correspondent, noting the contrast between Catherine's swift and decisive public support for Louise and her absolute silence in the face of Meghan's unraveling, captured the institutional position in a single sentence. "The palace does not need to say anything," she wrote. "Its silence is already the loudest thing in the room." There is a question that sits beneath every element of what has unfolded over these past weeks, beneath the rodeo drive entrance and the 11-minute Paris boardroom meeting and the unreturned calls and the stylist's carefully chosen television appearance and the palace's equally carefully chosen silence. It is not a question about fashion. It is not a question about brand alignment or celebrity partnerships or the commercial mechanics of luxury endorsement. It is a question about legitimacy. About where it comes from, how it is built, how long it takes to accumulate, and how much faster it can be lost than it was ever gained. Meghan Markle has spent the better part of a decade engaged in one of the most ambitious personal rebranding exercises in modern public life. She left an institution that she found constraining. She built, with considerable intelligence and considerable resource, an alternative platform designed to generate the kind of cultural authority that does not depend on inherited title or institutional permission. And for a time, the architecture of that platform appeared to be holding. The Netflix deal, the podcast, the carefully curated public appearances. The social commentary delivered through the precise vocabulary of a woman who understood exactly how contemporary progressive audiences wanted to be addressed. It was, as a construction, impressive. What Chanel's decision revealed, with a clarity that no amount of communications management can obscure, is that the foundation beneath that construction was always thinner than it appeared. Luxury at the level Chanel occupies does not respond to narrative. It does not recalibrate in response to cultural pressure. It does not, unlike so many institutions in the modern landscape, feel the particular anxiety of needing to be seen on the right side of the right conversation at the right moment. It operates according to a value system so internally consistent and so long established that external turbulence simply does not reach it in the ways those outside it assume it must. When Chanel closes a door, it is not making a political statement. It is not participating in a cultural debate. It is simply applying, with the same consistency it has applied for over a century, a standard whose terms have never changed and whose enforcement has never required justification. That is precisely what makes the closure so devastating to those it is applied to. There is no appeal mechanism. There is no reframing that reaches it. There is no interview that reverses it. The door is closed, and the closing is permanent, and the institution that closed it will never discuss the matter publicly, because discussing it would imply that it considers the matter discussable. It does not. What is happening privately behind the walls of Montecito, according to sources who have been in contact with people close to Meghan's inner circle in the weeks since the Rodeo Drive incident, bears very little resemblance to the composed and purposeful public image her team has continued to project. There is, those sources describe, a reckoning underway of a kind that the previous crises in Meghan's public life had not produced. Previous controversies had always contained, somewhere within them, an antagonist that could be named, an institution that could be characterized as hostile, a system whose structural biases could be invoked to explain the resistance she encountered. What the Chanel situation has produced is something more disorienting. An adversary that will not engage, that cannot be characterized as motivated by bias, without the characterization collapsing immediately under scrutiny, that has simply applied its standard and moved on without a backward glance. Against that kind of opposition, the tools that have served Meghan's narrative for years are not merely ineffective. They are counterproductive. Every deployment of them makes the underlying problem more visible rather than less. The contrast that the cultural moment keeps returning to, the comparison that appears with increasing frequency in editorial columns and social media commentary and private conversations among royal observers who have watched both trajectories with professional attention, is the one between Meghan Markle and Lady Louise Windsor, two women navigating the same institution from opposite directions. One spending years pursuing the visibility, the endorsements, the cultural platforms, and the institutional legitimacy that she felt the monarchy had denied her. The other declining a formal royal title in a forest green coat on a snowy Highland morning, turning down the elevation the institution offered and building something quieter and more durable in its place. The public's response to both women in this moment is not complicated. It does not require analysis or decoding. It is simply the latest expression of something that has always been true and that the modern appetite for authenticity has made impossible to ignore. People know the difference between someone who is trying to become something and someone who simply is something. They have always known. And in a cultural moment, exhausted by performance and hungry for the real, that difference has never mattered more. Chanel knew it 11 minutes into a boardroom meeting in Paris. The rest of the world is catching up.